Welcome to our course. My name is Matt Taylor, and I'm the Protestant scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. And we're really glad that you are joining us for this course. It is a 3-week course, and we're going to be thinking about American Christian nationalism. We'll be doing some history, some constitutional law, some historical comparisons tonight. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get up off the ground here. All right, so this course is titled Christian Nationalism Undefined. And we very intentionally chose that word undefined. If some of you may have joined us, my colleague Ben Sachs, our Jewish scholar, did a course on anti-Semitism undefined. And part of the premise of this series and of these courses is these are very contentious topics. These are phrases that get thrown around or ideas that get thrown around a lot. And sometimes it's very hard to pin down what people mean by these phrases and these words. So we are not here to say there isn't a definition. We're here more to say we want to explore those definitions together and think together about the different ways that these ideas are getting used and propagated and argued in our public square. So the premise that I have for this 3-week course is that American Christian nationalism is one of the most important and most poorly understood political topics of our time. And we'll be exploring this with 3 different lenses. So each week we'll take a different lens to think about this particular topic and the challenge that it poses to our civil society. So tonight we'll be looking at American history and at demography and thinking about why do some people claim that the US was founded as or is essentially a Christian nation. So we'll be doing a lot of this kind of definitional work tonight. And then next week on the 28th, we will talk about this idea of how this intersects with race. So some analysts and scholars who study Christian nationalism very much prefer to talk about white Christian nationalism as the real locus of the problem. So next week, we will ask this question of how white is American Christian nationalism today? And so we'll be doing a little bit more survey data and thinking about it that way. And then our final week, we're going to be thinking about the moment that we are in right now. And as we are living into another contentious election season, with Donald Trump seemingly the Republican candidate and Joe Biden seemingly the Democratic candidate, barring something hugely unforeseen. What are the Christian nationalism trends that we should be paying attention to as we enter into this season? So what we're going to start out with, though, is a little engagement activity. So in your corner right here, you can see there's a little QR code. There's also you can just go to slido.com. But what I want you to do is either, I think we might even have a link in the chat as well, if Katie can manage to throw that in there. Go and you can go from your phone, go from your computer, open a browser window, go to slido.com, or if you just do the QR code on your phone, it'll pull it right up. And then you put in this little code, this little 7-digit code. And this question will be on there. In one word, what would you say is the greatest cultural, and by that I mean not economic and not foreign policy, what is the greatest cultural crisis facing the United States right now? And try to get it down to one word, because we're going to have a word cloud that will populate on the screen as you fill this in. So try to come up with, and you can take a minute, but try to boil it down to one word. What is the one phrase or word that you would say is the greatest crisis facing the United States right now? And as you watch the screen, you'll see as people, the more people put one word in, the bigger it will get. So it'll give us a sense of a pulse of where we are all entering into tonight. And I notice a few of you are also putting them in the chat. That's fine as well. If the Slido thing is a little too complex for you, that's okay to put it in the chat too. Okay. We have 32 participants so far. Maybe wait for a few more. So it looks like democracy and racism are topping out our list. We're also seeing a lot of polarization, selfishness, extremism, hate, authoritarianism, disinformation, education, partisanship, fascism, distrust, pluralism, divisiveness. Wow, we are full of concepts here. All right. Well, this is helpful, and I think I would agree with most of these being crises that we are facing in the country right now. I've given this question a lot of thought, and I'd like to try to offer what my answer to this question would be. And I'm going to take the presenter's privilege and say that I think there are actually 3 overlapping crises that we are stuck in this moment, that we are grappling with as a society. The base layer of our crisis right now, I would say, is polarization. And I noticed that a few of you put that in there as well. And by which I mean Americans are divided across the board. There's no center anymore in our political spectrum, or the people who are trying to kind of stand in the center get pulled out of that center, right? All of the issues that we face as a society are politicized. And so we have these coalitions that have formed between rural and exurban just being kind of the layer outside of suburban, right? You have urban, which is kind of the city center. Suburban is the neighborhoods and communities that surround the city. And then exurban is the next layer out before you get to rural. So the rural and exurban communities against the urban and suburban communities, right? The kind of red districts versus the blue districts, the red states versus the blue states, the college educated versus everyone else, right? And we could go through this by race, by gender, right? You can really track how people identify politically by how they identify in other dimensions of their life, right? And that is what political science would call polarization. People are pulled in these different directions, and our nation is being pulled in these different directions. And that polarization has given rise to a governance crisis in our society. In case you haven't noticed, our federal government does not get very much done these days, right? Our Congress is stymied by this polarization. In fact, if anything, that polarization that we observe in broader society is almost worse among our elected officials, who seem to typify that polarization, right? And our elected leaders can't or won't compromise, again, because there is no center, right? Everyone is seeking the advantage of their party, the advantage of themselves. And so we can't pass legislation. We can't address real world needs. And if you need an exhibit A, I would just look at the US border right now. And it seems like there is broad observation and agreement that there is a real crisis and a real need, but nothing is getting passed, right? Because there's no space even for negotiation and compromise, or even when things get negotiated, it can't get passed. It cannot enter into actual legislation. And those 2 crises are made even worse by, and I'm going to use a fancy academic word here, our epistemic or epistemological crisis. And epistemology is just a fancy word for how we know what we know, right? How we have access to information, how we have access to knowledge. And different kinds of Americans today live in different informational universes through their media, through their social media, through the news they consume, through the shows that they watch. So we can't even have a common conversation about shared facts at this moment, right? We are in many ways just stuck in these interlocking crises. And if you need any evidence for this epistemic or epistemological crisis that we are facing, here's a demographic fact. About 1/3 of our country today still believes that Donald Trump won the 2020 election, right? That is not merely a polarization thing. That is an epistemological problem. They the information that they consume, the social universe they exist in, tells them that this is true. And that problem is made even worse among certain demographics. Among evangelical Christians in the United States today, among white evangelical Christians, it's about 2/3 believe that Donald Trump won the 2020 election. Right? So that is aggravating these other crises, right? Because it's not only that we're polarized, it's not only that we can't come to political compromises, it's that we almost live in different informational ecosystems that don't even touch each other and that are positioning themselves in opposition to each other. And I would argue that rather than thinking of Christian nationalism as a separate crisis, I think Christian nationalism is part of the vicious circle that makes each of these societal crises worse, right? So Christian nationalism is amplified by all of these, right? Christians experience this polarization, especially conservative Christians or Christian nationalists experience this polarization, and it more firmly locks them into their camp. I have talked to some of our elected representatives in the last few months, and they say the Christian nationalism element in Congress is worse than it is in broader society. It's more accentuated even in the halls of Congress than it is in broader society. It's even more evident there. It's even more popular there, right? And so it's fueling this governance crisis, right? Many of the people who are most stalwart against anything happening in our government are also Christian nationalists. And then Christian nationalism is also fueled by this epistemic crisis, but also making it much worse. Many people believe that Donald Trump won the 2020 election, not just because they saw some evidence that convinced them, even though this has been adjudicated in uncountable courts. They believe it because it's theology for them. They believe it because there are prophecies. They believe it because there are other factors that are coming more out of the religious epistemic world that are shaping the way that they think about our politics. And we'll talk about that in our third week especially, right? So Christian nationalism is in some ways an accelerant of all of these crises that we're facing as a country. So I want to dial it back a little bit though, because I haven't defined Christian nationalism yet intentionally. And I want to dial it back to think, well, what are we talking about generally, right? And Christian nationalism is just one form of what we could talk about as religious nationalism in general, right? So religious nationalism is this broader phenomenon that really has emerged in the modern world. And it's emerged in part because religions are old and nations are new, right? You have language of nations that goes back really millennia, if you want, but the modern nations that we inhabit, these national identities that we carry around that are often detached from ethnicity, often detached from race, but are defined by borders, defined by the government that we swear allegiance to, that are not feudal estates, they're not ethnic tribes, right? But the way that we function in nations today is pretty new. Most of what we think of as the modern kind of international system really goes back to the Peace of Westphalia. And if you haven't heard of the Peace of Westphalia, it's a very important episode in especially European history. The Peace of Westphalia comes at the tail end of the Protestant Reformations, right? So Protestant Reformations launched in the early 16th century, around 1517, if you're focused mostly on Luther. And it creates a series of religious wars that inflame Europe for over 100 years. Right? It's not just Protestants against Catholics, which is how a lot of times we think about it. It's also Protestants against other Protestants. And as you have nations that are emerging at the same time, these modern nations that are emerging at the same time, these different forms of Protestantism, different types of Catholicism are getting layered in to these nations and creating and accelerating these wars that are going on, that are brutal and are political, and are also religious and are often framed as holy wars over theology. And so the Peace of Westphalia that is kind of orchestrated in 1648 is in many ways trying to bring an end to these religious wars in Europe And the solution they come up with is that we will have sovereign nations. We will have nations that control what is going on within their own boundaries. There's not going to be a Holy Roman Empire that is going to kind of operate over different nations, and religious communities will live within the boundaries of those nations. And the ruler of that nation will have power over violence in that nation. The state controls the violence. And the state also governs religion within the boundaries of that nation. And those boundaries are basically arbitrary, right? They're historical, but they're more or less arbitrary, right? Why is the border between the United States and Mexico where it is? Well, you could go back and reconstruct historically what were the wars that were fought and treaties that were arranged, but it's basically an arbitrary line that gets drawn for historical reasons. But if you are on one side of that line, you're in Mexico, and if you're on the other side of that line, you're in the United States. If you're on one side of that line, you swear allegiance to the government of Mexico. If you're on the other side of that line, even if you're just a mile away, you are swearing allegiance to the United States. Even if you share an ethnic and religious background with the people on the other side of that line, because of that's where the border is drawn, you belong to that nation. Right? That is a new way of thinking about humanity, about our allegiances, about our identities that has really emerged in the last 400 or 500 years. And so the relationships in this kind of post-Westphalian world, the relationships between religions and states are perpetually being renegotiated through laws and policy, right? It's not stable. Each state is having to reckon with how it thinks about religion. And depending on how you count secular, only about 25 nations out of the, 250 plus nations in the world would be officially secular. As in they do not have an official state religion, what we would call an established religion. The vast majority of nations in the world do have some established, as in an officially recognized state religion. That's how most of the world has solved this problem. Now, in a lot of those cases, those established religions are what we would say vestigial, right? They're an interesting historical artifact that comes from the history of that nation, but they might not have any bearing on how people live their day-to-day lives. Sometimes those religions are quite active. If you need a good example, look at the recent coronation of King Charles. It is a religious ceremony performed by the head of the Church of England, the Archbishop of Canterbury, crowning the king, right? It is a marriage of religion and state, which has been the arrangement ever since Henry VIII, more or less, in England, right? So when we in America talk about separating religion and state, we have to recognize that that is a particular conversation that has emerged within the United States and within our history that has resonances with other states, but is distinct compared to the vast majority of the world where there's a much more easy connection between religion and government. So religious nationalism, when we talk about religious nationalism, is the ideological effort to blend your religious and your ethno-national identities. Right? It's trying to find ways of putting those two layers of your identity together. That's what we talk about as religious nationalism. And you can say that's all bad. You can say, oh, there's some forms of it that are okay. I'm fine with people singing "God Save the King" in England. I just don't want that, right? Like there's a lot of nuance in terms of how people relate to these ideas of religious nationalism. So we're going to do another little exercise here. So if you haven't already pulled up the chat window, pull that up. And I want you to look at this phrase. America is a Christian nation. Maybe even more than 50%, according to some surveys, of Americans would say yes to that. What does that statement mean to you? And what is someone affirming if they agree with the statement, America is a Christian nation? Why don't you type your answer in the chat? Try to keep it down to about a sentence or a phrase or two, but what does the sentence mean to you? And what is someone affirming if they agree that America is a Christian nation? I'll give you a couple minutes. Okay, I know some of you are still writing, but let me. These are fascinating answers. So let me just read some of these because I think they will help set up the rest of our conversation here. So cultural dominance, as in kind of Christianity's cultural dominance, that America was founded on Judeo-Christian values. We'll talk about that phrase. most Americans are Christian, right? So this is a demographic understanding of that, right? That is about the majority of Americans. That it means that I don't belong here, somebody said. People would like the destruction of non-Christians. People might be saying, I want power to reside among people who look and believe like me. Misconceptions about how America came about. It means America excludes some citizens, affirms a tacitly white and Christian America that dominates and ultimately expels outsiders. Other groups have lesser status. It means that only Christians are truly American. As someone Jewish, it makes me feel like an outsider. America does not have a national religion. The phrase suggests Christians are the only religious group that matters. Okay, well, we'll get into all of these. This is fascinating. So many holidays, days off, and calendar. Founding documents are based on a Judeo-Christian ethic, right? I think we are seeing even in these answers that there's disagreement. This phrase is ambivalent in many ways. There's not a common understanding of what this phrase means. So if I was trying to break this phrase down, I've spent a lot of time paying attention to how people are using this phrase, how they're thinking about this phrase, how it plays out in survey data. I'd say there are at least 4 ways that people mean this phrase when they agree to it. And they go in wildly different directions if you think about it, just like our little experiment in the chat here. So the first is demography. Right, people are making a statement about demography, about the demographic makeup of the United States, that America is a nation of Christians or a majority Christian nation, right? If so, and we'll look at some of those statistics tonight in the demography, what percentage of Americans must be Christian for this to be true? Is it if 51% of Americans are Christian, is America a Christian nation? Does it have to be a supermajority? Do we need 66% of Americans to be Christian for America to be a Christian nation? Or does it need to be 90%? Does it need to be an overwhelming majority? Right? That's an unanswered question for a lot of people who want to say, well, it's just a demography answer. Some people are talking about history, and we saw that in some of the responses in the chat, that America was established by Christians or on Christian foundations. And sometimes people will even use the phrase Judeo-Christian, which we'll get to. And if so, if that's true, then what historical data do we have to substantiate that? What statements do we have from the founders or from the generation of the founders that substantiate that somehow Christianity was intrinsic to the founding of the United States? Speaking of intrinsic, some people are making a statement about the essence of America, that America is essentially or spiritually Christian, right? That somehow there's a Christian quality, right? And this is where you hear this language of values, right? That there's Judeo-Christian or Christian values underneath America. And if so, what does that mean? And what does that mean on a practical level? Okay, if we were to grant that, well, what does that mean? What's the practical effect of that? If there is some Judeo-Christian essence or Christian essence to America, well, does that mean Christians have more rights? Or does it just mean there's some ethereal essence to America that is somehow vaguely Christian? The last level is maybe, I think, what people were most alarmed about is on a policy level. And this is the idea that Christianity and or Christians should be privileged in the public square over other religious or non-religious identities, right? This is the idea that this is where these ideas really start to have some more bite, right? I think a lot of people can be like, oh, you can talk about essences, I don't really care. You can talk about values, that's not my thing, right? Or history, I mean, it's a debatable question, really, historically. You can ask several different historical scholars of early America, and they'll probably have very different takes on this question, right? Or the demography question. But when it comes to policy, Christians should, or Christianity should be privileged over other religious or non-religious identities. Well, what do you do with that? How do you square that with American values of equality or separation of religion and state, right? So really we have this challenge of, it's not just about defining Christianity and defining America and these things, but even when people are saying the same thing, they're often meaning something different. I would actually argue that most people who answer this question are not thinking categorically like this. Most people who answer yes to this question, they are believing some mixture of these things, right? And it probably varies from person to person, right? Some people, they're just making a demographic statement and they're not talking about values or essences or policy. They're just saying we're a majority Christian nation. There's some people who mean this very much about policy, right? And so we could, if we were creating a spectrum of forms of Christian nationalism, we might say some of them are benign, are fine. People believe something about American history, but it doesn't have any practical effect in their lives or their behavior. Some of them are very troubling to think about. Well, Americans who are Christian are premier citizens, or Christianity should be privileged. Well, what about Jewish people? What about Muslims? What about Buddhists? What about Hindus? What about atheists? What about people who just don't really want anything to do with any religion? Are they less privileged? They have fewer rights, right? So there's a lot of debate, and I think a lot of the reason that this has been such a contentious debate, this Christian nationalism concept has really emerged. I would say it really emerged in our kind of public discourse in 2020. People have been using the phrase Christian nationalism for well over 100 years, but it has kind of emerged in our consciousness in a different way since 2020. But it's been a very contentious debate, I think in large part because people don't boil it down to what they actually mean by it. They're just using vague phrases, and they're having fights and talking past each other because they aren't bothering to actually get into the nitty-gritty of what they mean and what their definition of a Christian nation is. All right, so let me give you an outline for where we're going to go today. This is a timeline of American history, going back to 1750 all the way up until the present. And just for the sake of kind of easy reference, here are some of the major kind of landmark wars that we fought, right? So Revolutionary War at the end of the 18th century, the Civil War in the middle of the 19th century, World War I and World War II in the first half of the 20th century, and then the Cold War, obviously the second half, majority of the second half of the 20th century. And I want to track two data points across this history and then correlate those with different eras of Christian nationalism and manifestations of Christian nationalism across that history. So one of these data sets comes, at least what we have today, comes through the General Social Survey, which is a survey conducted every year, sometimes every 2 years, of all Americans. And this is the percentage of Americans identifying as Christians. The General Social Survey only goes back so far. We have other data that we can correlate with, going back really more or less to the beginning of the United States. Obviously, they weren't doing polls as in surveys and phone calls back then, but we have some good data. And for the vast majority of American history, 90% or more of Americans identified as Christian, all the way up until 1990. And the General Social Survey, and basically every other survey that you look at on this, they all come up with slightly different numbers in terms of percentages. But in the 1950s, it was 89%. 1990, it was 90%. And then you see this sharp drop beginning in 1990, going all the way down to about 62 or 63% today. Right, so there's been a very radical shift over the last 30, 35 years from 90% of Americans identifying as Christian just plummeting down to 63%. And that plummet is continuing, at least as far as we can tell from the survey data. It doesn't seem like that trend is decelerating necessarily. Now, the other data point that I want to track across this history is the rates of church membership. This is church membership. So this is Christians who belong to a church. And what we see there is something actually very, very different, right? And some of this is coming from Rodney Stark and Roger Fink's book, The Churching of America, which, if you're interested in some of this history, is a really interesting book. I strongly recommend it. I think they've got a lot of very interesting analysis there. And part of what they are doing is they're comparing the actual roles of Christian denominations, the tallies that the churches themselves are doing of members. And what they find is that actually at the time of the Revolutionary War, very few Christians, very few Americans belonged to churches. It's only about 17%, as far as they can reconstruct, of in the founding era of Americans who belonged to churches. Church membership was harder to do back then. Sometimes you had to pay dues to belong to a church. It was seen as more of kind of an elite thing, but it was a relatively impious era of American history at the founding. And then you see this very rapid surge in the beginning of the 19th century, which is the period that we call the Second Great Awakening. That number doubles by the time of the Civil War, up to 34%. And it continues to rise throughout the rest of the 19th century. So about the 1900, it's around 51%. And it continues to rise from there over the course of the early 20th century until in the era of the Cold War, it's about 59 to 62% of Americans are saying we belong to a church. And then Gallup, because the survey data or the work that Fink and Stark are doing kind of ends in the year 2000, you can pick it up with Gallup from there. And again, we see this stark trend. Starting around 1990, rates of American church membership plummet down to about 47% today. What we found, what Gallup found was I believe it was 2022, was the first year since they began doing this survey that less than half of Americans belong to a congregation. Because Gallup is actually not asking church membership. They are asking membership in any congregation. They say in a synagogue, mosque, or church. I guess they aren't asking about Hindu temples and Buddhist communities, but they are among the Abrahamic faiths. 47% of Americans today belong to a congregation. And that's the first time that Gallup had ever found it below 50%. So we are living into an era that is less religious, less pious than just about any era in living memory, right? That is in some ways going back towards the lack of religiosity that we saw at the founding of the country. That's the direction we're trending right now, right? So what I want to do for the remainder of our time, and I'm hopeful that we'll have some time for Q&A, and we're also going to do a breakout room after I run through some of this history. So please pay attention, as you'll need the data for the breakout room. But I want to look at 4 different eras and the way that Christian nationalism manifests itself through American history in these different eras. And we'll look at each of them separately, and then we'll try to synthesize a little bit at the end. So let's dig into the era of the founding. So if we're thinking again, we're looking at an era at the US founding where maybe 90% of Americans are identifying as Christian, but almost all of that would be Protestant at the founding era. There would have been small pockets of Catholic communities, but vast majority of Americans are identifying as Protestant Christians, but only about 17% are members of churches. That's a big divide. There's a big gap between identification and practice that's going on in the founding era. This late 19th century, for each of these eras, I want to think about, for Christian nationalists, from the perspective of Christian nationalists in that era, what is the threat that they are facing? And for the Christian nationalists who were present in the founding era, the threat that they perceived was this new concept of separating religion from state. It was a new idea in the 18th century that nobody had ever really enacted until the founders of the United States tried to put it into effect. And then the French tried to do something similar after their revolution right around the same time as the Constitution, right? So but this is a brand new idea, brand new way of approaching, right? This is a post-Westphalian, post-Enlightenment experiment of how do you disentangle religious identities from national identities, or at least religious identities from the government's identity, right? And for the founders, this is a very important part of the experiment of the United States, right? The late 18th century, as we saw, is a low point in American Christian piety, at least as measured by church participation and membership. And there's other data to back that up, right? It's not merely coming from this book by Stark and Fink. You can look among the founding fathers about how they practiced and thought about their faith, how they wrote and talked about faith. They were not a terribly pious group of people. Some of them were, the majority of them were not, right? And many American founders were influenced by the Enlightenment and by this deistic trend that came out of the Enlightenment. Deism is a form of religion, sometimes even a form of a type of Christian religion. But the concept of deism that is very much aligned with the Enlightenment is, yeah, there is a creator, there is a God, right? People had, at least pre-Darwin, people had a very hard time conceiving of a universe without God. Where did everything come from if there isn't a God who started it all? But the deists would say God was the eternal clockmaker who made creation as a clock and set it running. And it was so well ordered and so well orchestrated that it runs on its own. Right? So the deists, and really the mood of the Enlightenment, wants to move away from supernaturalism, from miracles, from miraculous interventions. Thomas Jefferson famously creates the Jefferson Bible, where he gets two different Bibles and goes through and cuts out all of the sections where Jesus is speaking and puts those together as his own little version of the Bible. And the Jefferson Bible is still given to members of Congress as they're coming in, because Jefferson really liked the morality of Jesus. He just didn't like all that icky supernatural stuff, all the miracle stuff and the historical stuff. He wanted the moral teachings of Jesus. A very deist move, right? Let's bracket all the funny claims about miracles. Let's just get down to the values, right? That's Jefferson's approach to Christianity in many ways. And the other reality of the Protestant of the early America, or the era of the founding, is there are many Protestant sects that had come over from Europe, right? The Protestantism fractured Europe, fractured all of these different nations that were emerging in Europe at the time. And so you have Scottish Presbyterians, and you have German Lutherans, and you have Swedish Lutherans, and you have Dutch Calvinists, and you have English Anglicans, and you have all the non-conforming types of Protestantism in England, the Baptists and the Anabaptists that are all kind of still floating around, that are settling in Pennsylvania. You've got the Amish, right? Like there's all kinds of different forms of Protestantism that have settled in the English colonies. And none of those Protestant sects are so dominant or so widely influential that they're a good candidate for a national religion. Because if any one of them gets picked as the national church, you're alienating a lot of people. A lot of Protestants, a lot of citizens are getting alienated if you choose any one church to be the national church. And so the founders, who had witnessed, sometimes at a distance, sometimes fairly up close, these religious national wars of Europe, they're skeptical of how established churches operated, how they consolidated power, and how they persecuted nonconformists. Right? In many ways, the debate that's going on in the founding of Massachusetts versus the founding of Rhode Island is a debate between these Congregationalist Presbyterian types and the Anabaptist Proto-Baptist types, right? Who are battling over this very idea of an established religion, that the government itself has power over religion. And so one of the fascinating documents that we get from this era that really speaks to this question is actually one of the first treaties the United States signed. It was called the Treaty of Tripoli. The situation of the Treaty of Tripoli is that if you think about the geography of the Mediterranean Sea, you have the Straits of Gibraltar as this very narrow entry point into the Mediterranean Sea from the Atlantic Ocean. And the Ottoman Empire at the time that ruled over North Africa had a very loose grip on North Africa. They didn't have much regional governance over North Africa. And so it was mostly tribal groups that were ruling over North Africa, and they were mostly Muslim. And they called themselves the Barbars, or the Barbary Pirates. And so many of the early military engagements that go on before the War of 1812 are between the United States Navy, which was not very strong at the time and it was just being created, versus the Barbary Pirates. And these are sometimes called the Barbary Wars, especially the ones that occur after the turn of the century and the beginning of the 19th century. But in the administration of John Adams, in 1796, they send a delegation of diplomats over to make treaties with these quote unquote barbaric pirates, these Muslim groups that are committing piracy around the Straits of Gibraltar and are creating trouble for U.S. shipping, because the U.S. is no longer protected by the British Navy. It was protected by the French Navy during the Revolutionary War, but now the U.S. is on its own and doesn't really have much of a navy and can't battle off the Barbary pirates. And so instead they do diplomacy. And one of the first of these treaties is what's called the Treaty of Tripoli. And you can go look up and read the whole thing if you're interested. And so these U.S. diplomats are negotiating with Muslim tribal chiefs in North Africa, and they come to this agreement. And in there, they insert an article that's fascinating into one of these treaties called the Treaty of Tripoli in 1796. And this is what it says in Article 11 of the Treaty of Tripoli. As the government of the United States of America is not in any way, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Muslimin, which just was their way of transliterating Muslims, and as the said states never have entered into any war or act of hostility against any Mohammedan, basically another word for Muslim, nation, it is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries. So here you have a statement. And this treaty comes before the US Senate in 1796. There's no objection raised to it. It is passed by unanimous consent in the US Senate. John Adams signs it, and it becomes an enacted treaty of the early United States. But here in this treaty that is just flying right through Congress is this very clear statement. The United States is not founded on the Christian religion. So case closed, right? I mean, there you have it, black and white. Except even at the time, especially afterwards, there started to be people, even in John Adams' cabinet, started writing letters back and forth and saying, gosh, that was not a really great statement. And one of Adams' cabinet secretaries even says, it always seemed to me that treaty was trampling upon the cross of Christ. Because if we're not founded on the Christian religion, what are we founded on? So even at the time of the founding, you have this tension, this back and forth. You also see this tension in the ways that the colonies that becomes the early American states think about religion. Now, if you think back to the sequence of history, right? You have the Revolutionary War, Declaration of Independence, you have the Articles of Confederation, and finally you have the Constitutional Convention and the ratification of the Constitution. So there's a lot of kind of turmoil about the American government going on in that period of the Revolutionary War and just after it. And in that same period, most of the colonies, most of the original 13 colonies had established churches already. The majority of the English colonies had an established state church that was a Protestant sect. And some of those carried over long after the US was founded and long after the First Amendment was created, right? Long after the Bill of Rights in 1789, you still have these established state churches in the states, because the First Amendment is about not having an established church for the nation. But many people argued, well, you can still have them in the states. So there actually are basically 4 tranches of disestablishment that occur within the states, within the early American states. 4 of the states had no established churches. So Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island did not have an official state church. They never had to get rid of one. Shortly after the Revolutionary War starts, North Carolina, New York, and Virginia get rid of their established state churches, which were all Anglican. But then look at this. South Carolina holds on until 1790, so after the ratification of the Constitution. Georgia holds on to their Anglican establishment until 1798. And to be clear, what it means if you have an established church, it means your taxes are going to the church. Part of your taxes that you pay to the state are supporting the state church. And now, look at where Maryland is. For those of us who are here in Baltimore, Maryland is the last Anglican state to give up establishment in 1810. And then the Congregationalists, those darn New Englanders, they hold on to their established churches for a very long time. Those Calvinists did not want to give up their state churches. And so Connecticut, 1818, New Hampshire, 1819, Massachusetts, those Puritans, they held on until 1833 with their established state churches. So you have a period of more than 40 years after the ratification of the Constitution, after the First Amendment, and this idealized separation of church and state is created, where people in Massachusetts are still paying taxes that are supporting Congregationalist churches. This really comes to a head in the state of Virginia. And perhaps not surprisingly, given how important Virginia is and how many of the founding generation lived there. But Patrick Henry was actually an advocate in the state of Virginia for a sort of generic Protestant establishment. He didn't want any single Protestant church to be the established church of the state of Virginia, but he wanted to have Protestantism in general be the established church. And so he writes this bill called a bill establishing a provision for teachers of the Christian religion. I would point out that just as now the debate is about education, it's about how religion intersects with schools. And so this is about schools that teach Christianity. And Patrick Henry's trying to establish a taxation system in Virginia that will support the propagation of Protestant sects through schools, but is not going to privilege any one of them. As long as you're a Protestant, as long as your church is Protestant, you can benefit from these tax dollars. And Jefferson and Madison pushed back very hard against this as loyal Virginians, and they create an alternative bill. So the Patrick Henry bill never passes the state legislature, but the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom that Jefferson and Madison carve out passes in 1786, and that is why church is disestablished in 1786, is because of this bill. And that same statute in Virginia becomes the forerunner, becomes in many ways the philosophical basis for the First Amendment that gets passed in 1789, just a few years later. If you go and read them, and there's all kinds of books you can look up kind of comparing the two, but you really see this train of thought, the way, this trajectory that is established between the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, this fight that goes on in Virginia about establishing the Protestant churches, this debate going on between Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson, that then becomes enacted in the First Amendment, right? So the founding era they're fighting over this stuff. They're arguing over this stuff. They're trying to conceptualize what a disestablished nation would look like. And those fights are often playing out in the individual states for most of the history of early America. All right, so let me see if I can summarize Christian nationalism in the founding era. The American founders struggled to conceptualize and live into a world without an established state church. This was a new idea at the time. They found it was a very difficult process to disaggregate these things, and it's tactical, and it's state by state, and they're really trying to hammer it out, because it's not an easy question, because there's no real precedent for what they're trying to do. And the First Amendment, if you remember, the First Amendment has kind of two dimensions regarding religion, right? It's that the Congress shall not establish a church. The Congress shall not establish any religion as the state religion, but then also people's free exercise of religion is protected, right? It's protecting both against this kind of majoritarian move to try to hijack the state and turn it into an established church, but also to protect the rights of people to live into their religions, right? But both of those dimensions are revolutionary in their time. And they're trying to forge a new model of a secular state. Not secular in the sense of atheistic per se, but secular in the sense of separating these two spheres of society, these two segments or arenas of society, the religion from government. It's a new idea, and they're trying to kind of grapple with it. So at the time, Christian nationalists, the people like, I would argue, Patrick Henry, and some of these other people who later kind of really regret the Treaty of Tripoli and argue against it, they're simultaneously a minority, right? They are not, the majority of Americans don't really seem to care that much about religion, but they're also supporters of the old system. And they're pushing back against this experiment of not having an established church. That's what kind of Christian nationalism looks like in early America. Now, let's move into the next stage of American history, the next era, where we think about the Second Great Awakening and the Civil War, basically the majority of the 19th century. So here the threat is different, right? Because by the time of the Civil War, there are no more state churches. All of the churches have been disestablished, both at the national level and at the state level. But now there's a new threat. And that threat is dueling North and South visions of Christian nationalism. The fight around the Civil War was not only about slavery, it was not only about regionalism or states' rights or all the kind of hackneyed things that you hear about. It was about slavery, but it was also about religion and these religious visions of America. In many ways, the Civil War was a holy war between two different strands of American Protestantism. So part of what we need to think again about that chart, right? That shift from 17% church membership in the founding era up to 34% church membership in the 1850s. Part of what is going on is what we call the Second Great Awakening. That really lasts, I mean, sometimes people date it from the 1790s. I think it really gets going much more in the 1810s up through basically the 1840s, right? And most of what we were talking about when we talk about the Second Great Awakening is actually the spread of Methodism and Baptist churches into the American frontier, where you have, it's no longer the Congregationalists in New England or the Anglicans in the Mid-Atlantic who are dominant. Suddenly you have these insurgent new types of Protestantism that are more energetic, more what we would call today evangelical in their orientation. And they are doing revival camp meetings on the front in the frontiers. And they have itinerant preachers, these circuit riding preachers like the Methodists had, who it was one preacher and he'd get on his horse and he'd ride from town to town and preach in each town. And maybe there are Methodist churches in each of those towns, but they didn't have a local pastor. It was an itinerant preacher who would go from town to town preaching in these different services. And so it's this innovation in American religion that fuels the Second Great Awakening, that fuels this surge in church membership and identification with churches. But this era is also where we see the foundation of a number of break-off sects and new religious movements like the Latter-day Saints, the New Thought movement, the Seventh-day Adventists, and spiritualism. All of these come out of what we talk about as the Second Great Awakening. In fact, there's a section of upstate New York that is called the Burned Over District. And it's called the Burned Over District because the people at times said the fires of revival burned through that district so many times that they just called it the Burned Over District. And so many of our religious movements that we think about as kind of distinctive American forms of religion today, like the Latter-day Saints, come out of the Burned Over District in upstate New York in the 1820s and 1830s. So we've got both the growth Baptists and the Methodists, and then these new kind of sectarian or alternate kind of religious identities that are also emerging at the time. And so this displaced these establishment churches, the Congregationalists, the Anglicans, even more, right? And leads to the surge in church participation. Because it's not just about, oh, I belong to my fuddy-duddy Congregationalist church and I guess I've got to go there. Suddenly it's exciting to be attached to religion in the era of the Second Great Awakening. Suddenly it's a lively experience. It's a participatory experience. People are converting. People are adopting spiritual practices. People are reading their Bibles. People are getting excited about religion. And that is the culture and the climate on the eve of the Civil War, is that there is this great new interest in religion and in Protestantism and in these different forms of Protestantism and these different forms of piety. And part of what happens in this era, in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, is many of the myths that you hear today about the religiosity of the founding fathers are shaped in this era. Because the American nation is very young, and people are trying to project back onto the founding the religiosity of the early to mid 19th century. So there's stories that you'll still hear today about, oh, well, Thomas Jefferson wrote this letter about how important religion is to morality. Well, he actually didn't write that letter. That was made up in the 1820s, right? Because people are trying to recast the United States in the garb of their newfound religiosity, right? And so these are old myths, but they aren't that old. They don't go back to the founding. They go back to the 1820s, 1830s, right? To shore up the new religious sensibilities of the time. And when we come to the Civil War in the 1860s, there's the famous quote from Lincoln's second inaugural. I think it's actually, this text is actually in the Lincoln Memorial on the wall in there, where Lincoln laments in his second inaugural both sides of the war, both North and South, read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes God's aid against the other. Lincoln is lamenting the way that the Civil War has become a holy war, that each side believes that they are the righteous army of God, that they are prosecuting the enemies of God. They're battling the enemies of God through the war, even though they're fellow Christians and they're reading the same Bible. Mark Knoll, one of the great historians of American evangelicalism, has a really fantastic book titled The Theological Crisis of the Civil War, where he really looks at how this newfound kind of evangelical piety, this proto-evangelical piety that has grown up in the Second Great Awakening, fractures in the Civil War. Because all these people believe that they're the new Christians. They are the American Christians. They are the Christian nationalists. And yet they're now battling their fellow Christians who are reading the same Bible, who are quoting the same verses. One of the great Christian nationalist hymns of American history, one of the great Christian nationalist anthems, is the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which was written by Julia Ward Howe, who was an abolitionist, a Northerner, obviously, who she was in Washington, D.C. in 1862, watched some of the Union troops drilling and practicing and doing their kind of preparations for war around D.C., and comes back to her hotel in Washington, D.C. and writes this poem, this anthem that becomes the Battle Hymn of the Republic. It's first published in the Atlantic in 1862. And the famous first verse is all about, right, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord, this apocalyptic vision. But if you go back and read some of the other verses, what is the Battle Hymn of the Republic about, right? I have seen him, as in Jesus, I have seen Jesus or God in the watchfires of 100 circling camps. They have builded him an altar in the evening dew and damps. I can read his righteous sentence by the dim and flaring lamps. His day is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Right? The Battle Hymn of the Republic is a Christian nationalist anthem of the Union Army. And Julia Ward Howe and all the people who popularize and sing this song, and there's still churches that sing this song today, she is saying, I see in the camps and in the fires around the Union Army altars to God, where they are bringing about the righteous sentence of judgment of God on the South. That's the Battle Hymn of the Republic, is the vision of the apocalyptic kingdom of God enacted through the Union Army and its victory over the Confederacy. It was also in 1864, you have the first time that the phrase "In God We Trust" was printed on US money. It was only on pennies at the time, and they didn't even continue it. But even that is a token of this Christian nationalist sentiment that is undergirding the cause of the North. But the same thing's actually going on in the South. The motto of the Confederacy was Deo Vindice, God is our vindicator. Right? If the motto of the North, or the motto of at least the founding era, is E pluribus unum, out of many one, the motto of the Confederacy is God's our vindicator. God will prove us right. And when they go to write a constitution for the Confederate States, they very intentionally take the preamble of their constitution and insert God into it, because there is no mention of God in the US Constitution. And the Confederate drafters of their constitution said, they have a godless, deistic constitution, we will have a godly constitution. And so they say, we are invoking the favor and guidance of Almighty God. And in fact, there was now, at the same time, as the Confederates started making this case of, well, we have a godly constitution, you have a godless one, there was an effort among clergy in the North to insert not just the name of God, but the lordship of Jesus Christ into the preamble of the US Constitution. There was a movement called the National Reform Association. It was the original NRA. And the original NRA, the National Reform Association, almost got it in. They petitioned Lincoln to change the US Constitution. It almost became an attempted constitutional amendment. They never quite got it off the ground. But there were a lot of supporters in the North who wanted to insert that Jesus is Lord over the United States into the preamble of the Constitution. Think about how our Supreme Court jurisprudence would look today if they had succeeded in that. Right? So this pushback against this secularism or the secularity of the state is going on very strongly on both sides in the Civil War. So to summarize what we're looking at in the era of the Civil War, as the US became more demographically Christian, we see a corresponding rise of Christian nationalist sentiment in this antebellum period. Right? But then that sentiment bifurcates. This Christian nationalism that is kind of fomenting and growing in the 1840s and 1850s splits. And it goes along with most Protestant denominations actually split between North and South in the lead up to the Civil War. Right? So you have this Christian nationalism that is growing, it's insurgent, but then it divides into this northern vision that we find in the Battle Hymn of the Republic of this liberatory and progressing America that, let's be really frank, there was still a lot of racism in the North. Right? It's not like, oh, these people are wonderful and anti-racist, right? There's still deep racism in the North, but they have this liberatory and progressing vision. We are fulfilling the promise of America, where in the South, the vision of Christian nationalism is a vision of an entrenched racial hierarchy. And they are using theology and Christian nationalism to undergird that Southern vision of a kind of white Christian hierarchy. But these two versions of American Christian nationalism could not coexist for that long. And so the South becomes more and more aggressive in the lead up to the Civil War, right? There's Bleeding Kansas, the effort to spread slavery into the territories, right? The trigger for the Civil War, at least if you're thinking on a broad scale, is not people trying to displace the status quo. It's the South trying to expand the status quo of slavery into more and more territory. That is the instigating battle. That's the cause that is giving rise to this, right? The Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act. Suddenly, slave laws are being enforced in the North. And Northerners are having to, if they encounter Black people, according to the law, send them back into slavery. Right? That is the moral crisis of the 1850s that then triggers this kind of secession and Civil War. Okay, our last era, or our second to last era, and the last one will be very brief, and then we'll have some time for a breakout room. Okay, let's talk about the mid-20th century, mid-century America and the Cold War. Let's think about the term Judeo-Christian, but first, I think we need to think about what is the threat that is being addressed by Christian nationalists in the mid-20th century. The threat in their perception is fascism and godless communism. So where does the term Judeo-Christian come from? Well, it's being used by different people in the 19th century, but until the 1890s, when people used the term Judeo-Christian, they were usually referring to Jewish Christians, people who were ethnically Jewish and religiously Christian. That's how the term was used up until the 1890s, when people used it. But then it was not about ideas or traditions or values. It was about Jewish Christian people. But then, as you have the rise of fascism, as you have the rise of Nazism and fascism in Italy, there's coalitions of Jews and Christians. Still, some of these organizations even still exist today in the 1930s, who begin to appropriate this term Judeo-Christian to describe an interfaith alliance among Protestants and Catholics and Jews against Hitler and against Stalin and against Mussolini. So this becomes this early interfaith coalition among Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. And this picture here is of protesters, and anti-Nazi protesters in New York. But look at the sign that they're carrying. It says they're targeting a specific company, Mills Sales Company, and then they've got the swastika of snakes that says Mills Sales Company sells Nazi goods. Hitler crushes Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. Boycott Nazi goods. So the anti-fascists of the 1930s who are an interfaith coalition, are trying to say, Hitler's a threat to all of us. He's not just a threat to Jews. And so we need to stand together in solidarity against Hitler and against fascism and against Stalin and against Mussolini. We need to stand against these things. And that's where this term Judeo-Christian really emerges in popularity, was in the sense of solidarity between these different groups, right? So we find statements like this one from Henry Wallace, who was the Secretary of Agriculture in 1940, who said the Christians of this land, he himself was Christian, share with the Jews the tradition of the prophets. The Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, the democratic tradition, and the American tradition are all one. You want to know why do people talk about Judeo-Christian foundation? It's sentiments like this from 1940 to the 1930s, right? This is where the rhetoric of Judeo-Christian really takes off. But it doesn't stay there, because American history doesn't stay there. And so what happens is you move into the 1950s, the end of World War II, the beginning of the Cold War, and suddenly that takes on a different valence. And so you have one of the paradigmatic books of the 1950s about American religion is written by Will Herberg, who himself is Jewish. And the title is Protestant Catholic Jew, an essay in American religious sociology. And here's a longer quote from Herberg's book. By and large, to be an American today means to be either a Protestant, a Catholic, or a Jew, because all other forms of self-identification and social location are either, like regional background, peripheral and obsolescent, or else, like ethnic diversity, subsumed under the broader head of religious community. So Herberg's argument in Protestant Catholic Jew is that if you look at demographics in the US in 1955, it's about 68% Protestant, about 23% Catholic, and about 4% Jewish. So Herberg does the math. He himself is Jewish, and he says, if you put all those together, that's 95% of all Americans. And he says in Protestant Catholic Jew, America is a three-religion country. By religion here, he's not talking about Christianity. He's saying Protestant is a religion, Catholic is a religion, Jewish is a religion. We are a three-religion country. But what he's doing is substituting an implicitly racialized Jewish Christian civic religion, which he calls the American way of life, for conventional Protestantism as the new backbone of American culture. And if you think, maybe it's a little bit racialized, let me read you a longer quote from what Will Herberg would write 10 years later in the middle of the Civil Rights Movement, because he was not a fan of the Civil Rights Movement. He wrote in 1965 in an essay in National Review, for years now, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and his associates have been deliberately undermining the foundations of internal order in this country. With their rabble-rousing demagoguery, they have been cracking the cake of custom that holds us together. With their doctrine of civil disobedience, they have been teaching hundreds of thousands of Negroes, particularly the adolescents and the children, that it's perfectly all right to break the law and defy constitutional authority if you are a Negro with a grievance, in protest against injustice. That's Will Herberg's dripping with sarcasm characterization of the Civil Rights Movement. He was very anti-Civil Rights Movement because he wanted to have a nice Protestant Catholic Jew establishment of America. And he saw MLK and the civil rights leaders as disrupting that orderly American Judeo-Christian nationalism that he was advancing. Right? But this is how people were thinking in the 1950s. This is the era of the Eisenhower administration. And it's in the Eisenhower administration that there are two significant changes to American civic practice that are still with us today. One is that, you know how that phrase in our Pledge of Allegiance, under God, that's not original to the Pledge of Allegiance. It wasn't in the original one. That gets inserted in 1954 to the Pledge of Allegiance on Flag Day in order to shore up this sense of we are godly Christians against those godless communists, or godly Judeo-Christians, I guess might be the preferred phrasing, against those godless communists. And it's also in 1956 that it becomes a matter of national policy that the phrase "in God we trust" is printed on all of our money. Right? It happened episodically in the 1860s, but it's in 1956 that it becomes a part of national policy. And implicitly in that the original motto of the United States, "E pluribus unum," out of many one, is replaced by "in God we trust." And it's still with us today. right? That's still on our money. That was enacted in the 1950s as part of a Cold War mobilization of Christian nationalism against godless communism. So, to summarize, at the height of American religiosity and Christian power, right? This is 90% of Americans are identifying as Christian, 60+% of Americans are members of churches. Judeo-Christian became a way to rebrand American Christian nationalism as an inclusive religious conception of America, but it also bolstered aggressive anti-communist foreign policy and downplayed American racism. And then left out of this inclusive vision are American atheists, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, African-American Christians, all of the above, right? If you don't fit Protestant, Catholic, Jew, you're not really a good American. But then this 1950s heyday of Christian optimism gave way to a 1960s breakneck shift in American morality with the sexual revolution, in immigration with the 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration Act, in jurisprudence around Supreme Court decisions, and in Christians' cultural power, especially white Christians' cultural power through the civil rights movement. We'll look at that very briefly, and then I'm gonna send you into your breakout rooms. Okay, so what happens in the 1960s? What is the threat? Well, that's what I want you to try to figure out in your breakout rooms. But you have white American Christianity's zenith of power and influence in the 1950s that we just looked at. And then almost immediately after the 1950s, starting the beginning of the 1960s, the Warren Court and the Supreme Court, their jurisprudence really starts to disestablish American Protestantism in a very powerful way. And again, it's happening in the schools. It's happening in education, right? So you have Ingle v. Vitale in 1962, and then Abingdon Township v. Shemp, where they are removing official prayers and Bible reading in public schools. And for those of us who are in Baltimore, there was actually a Murray v. Curlett that was an adjunct to these lawsuits. There was another Supreme Court case that was based in Baltimore about prayer and Bible reading in public schools. That was in Baltimore City public schools, right? But that suddenly after the early 1960s, that's taken out of public schools based on the First Amendment, based on this disestablishment principle, but it had been basically dormant for 170 years until the 1960s. Right? And then you have, on top of that, the civil rights movement that not only demands equality, but exposes white Christianity's long complicity and oppression. Right? Many of the people pushing back on the civil rights movement are not just Southerners, they're Christians in white Christians in other parts of the country who are more sympathetic with the Will Herberg way of viewing things and don't want to lose their cultural power, don't want to face the dark side of American white Christianity. And then when the Cold War ends, when the Soviet Union falls, church membership and Christian identification plummets. Right, starting in 1990, you see the sharp drop from 90% of Americans identifying as Christian down to 62, 63% today. From 62% of Americans being church members to less than 47%, because that's also including Jews and Muslims in that 47% today, right? So there's this shift, this catastrophic shift from the perspective of Christian nationalists across all these spectrums. So we're going to go into breakout rooms now. We're going to have 10 minutes. There should be like maybe 6 or 7 people per room. And very quickly introduce yourselves, but I want you to try to grapple with these questions. First, given everything that we've seen, and my colleague Katie just put these in the chat, so you don't have to write them down, they'll be in your chat when you get into your breakout rooms. Given everything we've just seen, all the history that we've just surveyed, what would you predict about the white Christian reaction to this huge loss of power? And then how would you characterize the Christian nationalism that we see in the US today compared with the historic forms that we've just surveyed? Okay, so what would you predict with all that you know about American history, about how white Christians react to this loss of power? And how would you characterize the Christian nationalism we see in the US today compared with these historic forms we just surveyed? So take 10 minutes, we'll come back and wrap up here. So I want to take us back to these 3 crises that I outlined at the beginning that I think are what is really in many ways driving our politics and our cultural battles these days, and how Christian nationalism is attached to all these things. In my reading of American history, the other time in American history that we have reached this level of dysfunction, this level of polarization, this level of theological and epistemic divide among American Christians is in the lead up to the Civil War. And I wanted to take the last couple minutes that we have to actually think about comparing Christian nationalism and slavery as topics or as parts of American history and American culture that have shaped the conflicts that we have. Now, my premise here is probably an apocryphal quote from Mark Twain about history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. So I'm not saying these things are exactly the same. I'm not saying that there's an inevitability about these things, but recognizing that there are certain patterns in our history, right? American slavery was a concept and a practice that was deeply embedded with race and racial prejudice and oppression. And I would say that Christian nationalism is somewhat embedded with race, and we'll talk about that more next week. So we'll hit pause on the race question with Christian nationalism and spend basically all of our time. American slavery and the battles over it was a debate about the founding of the United States that was rooted in two different visions of the US project. And Christian nationalism is that as well, right? The fight that we're having today over Christian nationalism is in many ways a battle about the essence of America, but also about the founding of America and how people are reading this history or projecting back their values and their ideas. And there's a myth about American history that says America was founded as a purely Christian nation, and any derivation from that is false. There's also a myth about American history that America was a perfectly secular nation from the start, and that Christian nationalism is a derivation. The reality is both those things are embedded in our history. Both those narratives have their roots in the way that our country was founded and the circumstances under which it was founded. American slavery was tied to economic and regional concerns, but it was also rooted in Christian theology, and Christian nationalism is very much similar in that. There are regional and economic dimensions to what we're talking about, but I worry greatly about people who want to boil down American history to economics as though money was the only driving force or power, because theology and belief and culture are also deeply important. It's what we fought a civil war over. American slavery was undergirded by a rhetoric of violence and superiority and self-defense for white people. And Christian nationalism is undergirded by a rhetoric of violence, superiority, and self-defense for Christians. And that's what you find if you go into these Christian nationalist circles today. And American slavery became increasingly desperate and militant and expansive. And the practice of it became increasingly militant and desperate and expansive in the lead up to the Civil War. And I would argue that what we are seeing right now is American Christian nationalism becoming increasingly desperate and militant and even expansive. We'll look at that more in the next couple of weeks. So I'm not saying we're on the eve of another civil war. I think it is predicting the future is a fool's game. The lights are all blinking red on America's civic warning panel. That we are living into another crisis that resembles the crisis that gave us the Civil War, around another topic rooted in our founding. And this is why I think American Christian nationalism is one of the most important topics as we enter into this election year, as we think about how American culture is operating today. Let me end with two reading recommendations if you want to do any follow-up on this session. The first is a book by John Fea called Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? A Historical Introduction. John Fea is an evangelical historian, but he's a good historian. And he's at Messiah College. And this is a very good book. It's a lot of it is rooted in primary sources. A lot of it is kind of quotations. But he's really showing these different sides of the American founding and the ways that different people throughout American history have argued about this question of, is America a Christian nation? The other thing that I'm recommending is a new podcast series by a guy named Warren Throckmorton called, the title of the series is Telling Jefferson Lies. And it's all about the most important Christian nationalist, and I'm going to put this word in big quotation marks, historian named David Barton, who is a hero to Christian nationalists for the way that he reads American history. He doesn't have any real degrees in history. But the podcast is showing how David Barton became so popular, but also how much he misunderstands and misconstrues American history. And again, it's done by a conservative Christian historian and thinker who's pushing back on this kind of Christian nationalist understanding of American history using good history. So I recommend both of those. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.